They laughed when she collapsed in the hospital corridor. No one stopped. No one helped. A nurse stepped over her chart like it didn't matter. A doctor said she was not urgent. But 20 minutes later, everything inside that hospital stopped, because the sound of rotor blades filled the sky, and a Navy helicopter landed directly on the hospital roof. Not for a soldier, not for a VIP, but for her. And no one in that building was prepared for what her name meant on that evacuation order. The hospital was already awake before sunrise. Machines had begun their steady rhythm hours earlier. Doors opened and closed without pause. Footsteps crossed polished floors in organized urgency. Everything appeared ordinary, familiar, predictable in its structure. Then she arrived. A woman stepped through the main entrance alone. No escort. No visible support. No conversation followed her in. She moved quietly, almost carefully, as if trying not to disturb the environment around her. One hand rested against her lower abdomen. Not dramatically. Not exaggerated. But enough to suggest something she was enduring silently. Her pace was slow, controlled, deliberate. She stopped at the reception desk. Waited. The receptionist did not look up immediately. Her attention remained on the screen in front of her. The glow of the monitor reflected in her eyes. After a few seconds, she spoke without lifting her head. "Take a seat. You'll be called when it's your turn." No curiosity. No urgency. Only routine instruction. The woman did not respond. She simply turned toward the waiting area and sat down. Not in agreement, but in resignation to process. Inside the waiting room, time moved differently. Names were called in a steady rhythm. Patients stood, entered consultation rooms, left with prescriptions or instructions. Life continued for everyone else. But for her, nothing changed. She remained in place, unaddressed, unnoticed in the flow of movement around her. A nurse passed by with a clipboard. Her eyes briefly landed on the intake list. She paused for less than a second. Then I continued walking. But just before leaving the area, she murmured, "Another low-priority intake." That sentence did not sound cruel. It sounded routine, and yet, it determined how every system inside the building would treat her moving forward. What none of them realized was that her arrival had already been recorded somewhere far beyond their awareness. Not in the hospital system they could see, but in something layered beneath it. Something dormant, waiting, far away from the hospital, inside a facility that was never listed on public medical infrastructure maps. A dormant monitoring terminal sat inside a sealed room. No activity. No operators. No daily use logs. It was meant to remain inactive unless a rare condition was met. For years, nothing triggered it. Until now. At exactly the same time the woman sat quietly in the hospital waiting room. The terminal screen flickered once. Then stabilized. A thin line of light spread across the display, followed by a single output. Subject identification initiated. A technician assigned to maintenance rounds stopped mid-step outside the room. He frowned, because no one had scheduled any system activation. He scanned the access panel. No entry record. No manual command. No authorized login. Yet the system continued operating. Another message appeared. Match found. The technician's expression changed. No confusion anymore. Concern. He slowly reached for the door interface. Paused. Then pulled his hand back. Because the system updated again. Do not terminate process. Inside the hospital, the woman shifted slightly in her seat. Her breathing remained controlled but uneven. She still had not been called. Still not acknowledged. Still waiting within a structure that continued functioning as if she was optional. A nurse walked past the corridor again. This time, she slowed without reason. Her gaze drifted toward the waiting area. specifically toward the corner where the woman sat. The nurse hesitated. A faint discomfort formed in her expression. Not something she could explain. Just an impression that something about the intake list no longer aligned with what she was seeing. She checked the chart once more, then frowned. Because the record contained sections she could not open. Locked fields. Restricted labels. Security markers that did not match civilian classification standards. She whispered to herself. This file isn't complete. Back in the restricted facility, the terminal responded immediately, as if reacting to that exact thought. A new line appeared. Data interference detected. The technician outside stepped backward, slowly, because systems do not respond to human observation, unless they are directly connected. And this one clearly was. Another update followed. Civilian location link stable. The technician's breathing tightened. He finally spoke into his radio. This system is active. I don't know how. It's reading live external medical data. Silence answered him. Then a voice returned. Controlled. Final. Confirm subject condition. He looked at the screen again, and saw something that made his hand stop mid-air. A live identifier had appeared. Not a code. Not a number. A designation. Priority class. Unknown clearance. And beneath it, a continuous status feed. Heartbeat. Vitals. Location. Real time. Linked directly to the hospital. Linked directly to her. The technician whispered. This shouldn't exist. But the system had already moved past confirmation. It had begun tracking. And now, I was watching her. Inside the hospital records office, a junior staff member pulled up the woman's intake file again. At first glance, everything appeared standard. Name field present. Basic demographics listed. Arrival timestamp recorded. But something felt incomplete. He scrolled downward. Paused. A section refused to expand. He clicked once. Nothing. Twice. Still nothing. A small red marker appeared beside the section header. Not an error message. Not a warning prompt. Just silence in visual form. He leaned closer. I tried another terminal. Same outcome. Restricted access without explanation. He frowned. This doesn't match any civilian intake structure. Behind him, a senior nurse walked past. Without stopping, she replied. Then it's a system glitch. Ignore it. But the junior staff didn't move on. Because beneath the visible data, another layer seemed to exist. Faint. Hidden. Unreachable. And it wasn't supposed to be there. He switched terminals again. This time, the screen hesitated before loading, as if the system itself was reluctant. Then the file opened fully, only for a moment. And in that brief window, additional lines appeared. Lines no one in the hospital had entered. A classification tag surfaced at the bottom. Restricted Medical Authority Override. The junior staff stepped back instantly. His chair scraped slightly against the floor. A passing doctor noticed. What's wrong? He didn't answer immediately. Then quietly said, This patient isn't categorized here. The doctor frowned. Everyone is categorized. But the junior staff shook his head, because what he saw contradicted that assumption. There were sections missing from visibility. Entire diagnostic history segments hidden behind sealed encryption. Not deleted. Not lost. But intentionally concealed. He whispered again. This file looks controlled from outside. At the reception area, the woman remained seated, her posture unchanged, still holding herself steady despite visible discomfort, still waiting, still unacknowledged. But something subtle had shifted in the environment. Nurses walking past began glancing toward her more frequently. Not openly, not directly, but in passing, as if an invisible signal had begun altering attention patterns. One nurse paused near the corridor entrance, checked the file list. Then I looked up toward the waiting area. Her expression tightened slightly. She muttered, "She's still here," and walked away faster than before. In the background system, another silent reaction triggered. The hospital database refreshed without command. Patient tracking tables re-indexed themselves, then paused, as if waiting for approval from an external source. A second later, a hidden log entry appeared. Cross-system verification active. No one in the building authorized it. No one even knew it existed. But it was now engaged. And it was syncing with something far away. Something watching her in real time. Inside the hospital control network, a routine update cycle was scheduled to run silently in the background. But this time, it did not complete as expected. The screen froze for half a second. Then it restarted itself. Without input. Without authorization. A new status banner appeared across multiple internal terminals. Priority alignment adjusted. A systems operator blinked slowly. He leaned toward the monitor. Then called out, "Who changed the triage order?" No response came, because no staff member had touched the scheduling panel. Yet the patient queue had shifted. Not visibly at first, but structurally. Some entries had been pushed upward, others pushed downward, and one record had been elevated beyond normal classification range. The woman's file. Inside the emergency coordination room, a supervisor opened the live intake dashboard. His expression tightened immediately. "This isn't manual sorting." A colleague stepped closer. "What do you mean?" He pointed at the screen. "Look at the override pattern. It's not human input." The dashboard refreshed again, this time slower, as if resisting itself. Then another message appeared. Resource redistribution initiated. The supervisor stepped back. Resource redistribution? At that exact moment, several departments began experiencing subtle changes. One consultation room delayed its next appointment without explanation. A diagnostic slot became unavailable mid-schedule. A nurse station lost access to standard triage filters for 2 seconds. Then restored. But something had already shifted. Not loudly. Not visibly. But structurally inside the hospital's workflow. Meanwhile, the woman remained seated. Still silent. Still enduring discomfort. Her presence unchanged. Yet everything around her was beginning to reorganize itself. Without consent. Without explanation. A senior doctor passed the corridor. Stopped. I looked toward the waiting area. Then checked his pager. Paused. Because his screen showed an unusual note. Patient status. Reevaluation pending external input. He frowned deeply. External input from where? No answer followed. Only silence. Then the system responded again. Faster this time. More assertive. Evaluation authority shifted. A technician near the desk stood up. That's not possible. The authorities can't shift mid-process. But the screen did not correct itself. Instead, it added a final line. Confirmation not required. Inside the hospital, a subtle tension began spreading. Staff who had ignored earlier inconsistencies now noticed something was off. Not in the patient herself, but in how the system reacted whenever her record was accessed. It behaved differently, almost aware, and far beyond the hospital walls. A separate network registered the same anomaly. A monitoring hub that had already been tracking her status updated its logs without delay, then flagged a new condition. Local system resistance detected, as if the hospital itself had begun noticing something it could not understand, and trying to respond, without knowing what it was responding to. Inside the hospital command center, the atmosphere shifted in a way no one could immediately explain. Screens that normally responded within milliseconds began introducing slight delays. Not crashes, not failures, just hesitation. As if the system itself was reconsidering each action before execution. A senior technician leaned forward. His eyes scanned the central dashboard, then narrowed. Why are triage permissions locking out staff access? No one answered. Because the access panel had already changed structure. Menu layers were missing. Controls had shifted position. Entire functions were grayed out without authorization logs. A second technician tried to restore settings manually. His keyboard inputs registered, but did not apply. Instead, the system generated its own response. Intervention denied. The room fell silent. He tried again. Same result. Then, without warning, a new directive appeared across every monitor. Patient priority lock engaged. A supervisor stood up immediately. That protocol doesn't exist in civilian infrastructure. But the system did not acknowledge the objection. It continued independently. External medical authority active. At that exact moment, inside the emergency wing, a nurse preparing the next patient paused mid-action. Her screen flickered. The patient she was about to call vanished from the queue, replaced instantly by a different entry. The woman's record. The nurse blinked. I looked again. Then whispered. Why is she overriding the entire schedule? Across the corridor, doctors began noticing similar disruptions. Appointment lists reshuffled. Diagnostic equipment timing adjusted without instruction. Medication charts briefly inaccessible. Then restored. Each correction carried the same origin signature. Unknown. Untraceable. Unapproved. A young resident stepped into the hallway. He looked unsettled. Someone is controlling hospital flow remotely. A senior doctor frowned. That's impossible. We're isolated from external command systems. But even as he spoke, his tablet updated itself. A single line appeared. Isolation breach confirmed. He froze. Then slowly lowered the device. Because that phrase meant something no one wanted to say aloud. The system was no longer contained. Meanwhile, in the waiting area, the woman shifted slightly. Still seated. Still quiet. But her condition had worsened. Breathing slower. Shoulders tense. Hands steady against her abdomen. Yet no one approached. Not because they ignored her now, but because something inside the hospital's flow was preventing standard engagement. Every time a staff member attempted to prioritize her, their system redirected them elsewhere. As if guidance itself had been rerouted. A nurse tried to call her file again. The screen responded instantly. Access restricted by active override. She stepped back. What override? No explanation came. Only escalation. A final system message appeared across multiple departments simultaneously. Extraction protocol preparation initiated. That line did not exist in any hospital manual. Yet it was now active. And at the same time, far beyond the building, a remote tracking facility registered a signal spike. A technician there stared at the data, then slowly spoke. They are preparing retrieval. Another voice responded. For a civilian patient? A pause. Then the answer came. No, for a classified asset. And inside the hospital, no one had yet realized that whatever was coming next was already in motion above them. Inside the hospital, normal operations were still ongoing on the surface. But beneath that appearance, everything had changed structure. Elevator timing no longer matched schedules. Ward coordination screens refreshed without input. Communication lines rerouted mid-transmission. Staff began noticing small inconsistencies that could not be explained individually. but together formed something unsettling. A system behaving as if it had a second operator. One no one could see. One no one could locate. A security officer standing near the entrance checked his radio. Static. Then clarity. Then static again. He frowned. Comms are unstable. A colleague responded immediately. It's not just comms. Internal routing is shifting. Before the sentence finished, a hospital-wide alert banner appeared briefly across every screen. Then it disappeared. Then reappeared again. Slower. Deliberate. As if being forced into visibility. The message read, "Airspace activity detected." A technician at the monitoring desk lifted his head. What airspace activity? No scheduled arrivals existed. No emergency aviation requests had been filed. No civilian air support authorized. Yet the system displayed a live feed. Outside the hospital perimeter, the sky had changed. Subtle at first. A distant vibration. Almost mistaken for thunder. Then it grew sharper. More structured. More mechanical. A sound that did not belong to the weather. A nurse near the window turned slowly. Her expression tightened. That's not an ambulance. Another staff member stepped closer. Looked upward. Paused. Because the sound was now undeniable. Rotational. Controlled. Approaching in a direct path. Inside the restricted monitoring facility. A separate terminal updated instantly. No delay. No confirmation request. Just execution. Unit inbound confirmed. A military analyst stepped closer to the screen. Her voice dropped. That signal pattern belongs to the Naval Extraction Class. Another technician shook his head. No civilian hospital request triggers that. But the system did not negotiate interpretation. It simply continued. Landing protocol engaged. Back inside the hospital, confusion began spreading in visible waves. Doctors stepped into corridors. Nurses paused mid-task. Security personnel repositioned toward exits. Everyone reacted to something no one had officially announced. A senior doctor looked toward the ceiling, then toward the windows, then spoke quietly. Who authorized air deployment over this facility? No answer came. Because authorization logs showed nothing. No record. No name. No approval trail. And yet, the sound outside was getting closer. Now directly overhead. Now undeniable. Now arriving. The woman in the waiting area shifted slightly again. Still seated. Still weakened. Still unrecognized. But for the first time, the environment around her was no longer ignoring her. It was converging toward her. A junior nurse whispered near the corridor. Why is everything focusing on that one patient? No one responded. Because even asking the question felt like confirmation of something larger. Then, the hospital lights flickered once. A single synchronized pulse across all floors. And every screen in the building displayed the same final line. Extraction unit has entered vicinity. Outside, the sound stopped rising. It stopped moving. It stabilized. Right above the building. Above the hospital. The sound that had been growing for minutes finally stabilized into a fixed position. No longer distant. No longer approaching. Stationary. Right overhead. Inside the building. Every department felt it in a different way. Not through announcements. Not through alarms. But through interruption. Monitors paused mid-refresh. Elevators halted between floors. Communication lines briefly detached from internal routing. As if the entire structure had acknowledged something arriving above it. A security officer rushed toward the stairwell access. Grabbed his radio. Nothing came through. Only faint distortion. He looked up toward the ceiling again. Then muttered. This is not standard response protocol. At the same time, on the top floor maintenance corridor, A reinforced access door vibrated slightly, then stopped. Then it opened. Not through manual entry, but through override pressure from the other side. Metal hinges released with controlled force. No explosion. No chaos. Just a precise entry. Boots touched the rooftop surface. Measured. Even. Deliberate. A small unit emerged from the aircraft above. Their movement was coordinated without hesitation. No verbal exchange needed. Only formation. Inside the hospital, a nurse near the stairwell froze. Because she heard it first. Steps. Not hurried. Not scattered. Structured descent. She turned toward the corridor slowly. Her expression tightened. Someone is coming down from the roof. Within seconds. Word spread through adjacent departments. Not officially. Not through systems. But through observation. Security personnel began repositioning upward. Doctors paused consultations. Administrative staff stepped into hallways. But none had authorization clarity. Because no internal record showed a scheduled landing. No emergency dispatch existed. Yet reality above them contradicted every log. On the rooftop access floor, the door finally opened inward. Cold air rushed through the stairwell. A presence entered the building. Unannounced. Unregistered. A hospital guard stepped forward cautiously. Raised his voice. Identify yourselves. No immediate reply. Only movement continued. Measured. Come. Then a single response came. Low. Controlled. Final. We are here for the subject. The guard frowned. What subject? Silence followed. Not confusion. No hesitation. But refusal to elaborate. Inside the command system room, a technician stared at the central monitor. The hospital-wide feed had locked again. This time on the upper corridor. He whispered. They bypassed entry authorization completely. Another operator shook his head. That level of override doesn't exist in civilian law enforcement. But the system responded instantly. A new line appeared. Military Extraction Authority confirmed. The technician stepped back. Because that phrase changed everything. Not just protocol. Not just procedure. It meant jurisdiction had shifted. And inside the waiting area, the woman remained seated. Still quiet. Still weakened. But no longer unnoticed by the system. Every connected screen in the building now carried a subtle indicator beside her file. Target active. A nurse walking past the corridor glanced at it. Stopped. Then slowly looked toward her. For the first time. Without distraction. Without dismissal. And in that silence, she finally realized something had changed. Not in her condition, but in how she was being seen. Inside the upper corridor, the atmosphere had already changed before anyone saw them. It wasn't noise that announced their arrival. It was an absence of normal activity. Staff voices dropped. Movement slowed. Even footsteps from different directions seemed to lose coordination. Then they appeared. Down the stairwell. Not rushing. Not searching. Moving with controlled certainty. Hospital security formed a loose line near the intersection hallway. One officer stepped forward. Raised his hand slightly. This is a restricted medical facility. State your authorization. The lead figure stopped. Not aggressively. Not hesitantly. Just enough to acknowledge presence. A short pause followed. Then the response came. We are not here for access negotiation. The officer frowned. Then explain your entry. No elaboration followed. Instead, one of the unit members produced a device. A small terminal. Activated it. The screen displayed a single identifier. No explanation. No header. Only a code line tied directly to internal hospital routing. The security officer looked at it. Then his expression changed slightly. because the system recognized it before he did. Inside the hospital network, alerts triggered silently across multiple departments. Not alarms. Not sirens. Just reclassification. The officer lowered his hand slightly. That clearance level doesn't exist in civilian jurisdiction. The lead figure replied, "It does not need to." At that moment, a distant sound echoed from below. Elevator doors opening. Movement approaching from lower floors. The hospital's internal coordination team began converging toward the same corridor. Doctors, nurses, administrative supervisors, drawn not by instruction, but by system-wide redirection, as if every path had been adjusted toward a single focal point. Inside the waiting area, the woman remained seated, still in the same position, still visibly weak. But now, something had shifted in how the building interacted around her. A nurse who passed earlier returned again, this time slower. Her gaze held longer. No confusion anymore. Recognition without understanding. She whispered, "They're actually coming here." Meanwhile, in the corridor above, the military unit continued forward, each step aligned with internal mapping that no hospital staff had access to. A doctor stepped into their path, attempted to assert authority. "You cannot proceed without medical authorization clearance." The lead figure did not stop, only replied, "Medical authority is not what governs this operation." The doctor hesitated, because that statement implied separation between hospital structure and whatever system was now overriding it. Behind them, security personnel attempted radio contact. Still no signal stability, only fragmented audio. Then sudden clarity. A single instruction emerged from internal speakers without source. "Do not interfere with extraction path." Every staff member froze, because no one had issued it. And yet the building itself had spoken. At the intersection corridor, both sides finally faced each other fully. Hospital personnel and the incoming unit. A long silence followed. Heavy. Measured. Then the lead figure spoke again. Not louder, but final. "Where is she?" No one answered immediately. Not because they didn't know, but because the answer now carried consequence. A nurse finally raised her hand slightly, pointed toward the lower wing. "The waiting area." She stopped mid-sentence, because she realized something unsettling. Every eye in that corridor had already shifted in that direction, as if they had known before she spoke. And in that moment, the corridor stopped feeling like a hospital passage. It felt like a guided path toward inevitability. Inside the lower wing corridor, movement slowed even further, not because anyone ordered it, but because every step now felt monitored. The hospital staff trailing behind the unit kept a careful distance. No one wanted to interrupt what was unfolding. No one understood what would happen if they did. The military team advanced without hesitation. Their focus remained fixed ahead. Not on the building. Not on the staff. Only the destination. As they neared the waiting section, ambient hospital noise began to fade in perception. Conversations reduced to fragments. Footsteps became softer. Even distant equipment sounds felt muted, as if the environment itself was narrowing attention toward one point. A nurse near the corridor entrance whispered, "Everything is leading there." No one responded, because the statement was already obvious. At the entrance of the waiting area, the lead figure stopped. For the first time since entry, a brief pause. Then a subtle hand signal. The unit aligned behind him. Perfect spacing. Controlled formation. Inside the room, patients remained seated. Some are unaware. Some were watching quietly. But none fully understand the shift occurring just beyond the doorway. And in the far corner, she was still there. Same seat. Same posture. Weaker now, but conscious. Her hand still rested near her abdomen. breathing shallow but steady. The moment stretched. No one moved forward yet. Not the hospital staff. Not the unit. Even the sound seemed reluctant to break the silence. Then a soft mechanical tone came from a device carried by the lead figure. A single pulse, followed by data confirmation. His gaze lowered briefly, then returned to her direction. A quiet acknowledgement passed through the team without speech. One of the accompanying officers finally spoke under his breath. Visual match confirmed. The phrase carried weight no one in the hospital fully understood. A senior doctor standing near the back leaned forward slightly. What does that mean? No answer came, because explanation was not part of their protocol here. Inside the hospital system network, another silent update triggered across all connected screens. No alert sound, just a line appearing and disappearing instantly. Target confirmed in view. A nurse glanced at her handheld monitor, paused, then slowly looked up toward the waiting area. Her face changed. Not fear. Not a shock. Something closer to realization. They're not guessing, she whispered. Meanwhile, the lead figure finally stepped into the room. Not aggressively. Not slowly. Just precisely. The rest followed. The space around them felt immediately different. Not physically altered, but perceptually weighted. Every staff member inside the waiting area now turned slightly. Watching. Waiting. A hospital clerk tried to speak, but no words came out fully formed. The presence of the unit suppressed casual motion. Not through force. Through certainty. The lead figure's eyes moved across the room. Scanning. Measuring. Then stopped. Locked onto the far corner. No hesitation. No second search. Just confirmation. He spoke quietly. Maintain position. The team halted. Perfect synchronization. At that moment, a nurse near the doorway swallowed hard. Why does it feel like they already know her? No one answered, because the answer was already visible in their behavior. They were not searching. They were arriving to retrieve. And in that silence, the woman finally lifted her head slightly. For the first time in hours, she sensed attention directed toward her. Not random. Not passing. Focused. Sustained. Approaching. Inside the waiting area, the air felt heavier than before. Not from noise. Not from movement. But from attention shifting in one direction at once. Every person in the room, staff and patients alike, now sensed the change. The arriving unit no longer scanned randomly. Their focus had narrowed completely. The lead figure stood still for a moment longer than before, then lowered his gaze toward a compact device in his hand. A soft pulse activated. The screen illuminated. Data refreshed instantly. A single record expanded. Not opened manually. Not searched. Just surfaced. A name field appeared. Then stabilized. The lead figure's expression remained controlled, but his posture changed slightly. More certainty. Less evaluation. He stepped forward. One pace. Then another. The hospital staff behind him instinctively held position. No one interfered. No one spoke. Because the atmosphere discouraged interruption. At the far side of the room, the woman remained seated. Still weakened. Still composed in silence. But now I'm aware. Her eyes lifted slightly. Not fully. Just enough to register direction of movement toward her. A nurse near the entrance whispered. They locked onto her. A doctor beside her frowned. Based on what confirmation? No answer followed, because at that exact moment, every internal hospital terminal across multiple departments refreshed simultaneously. Not with error. Not with warning. But with a single synchronized update. Identity match protocol initiated. In the administrative office, a supervisor turned sharply toward the central screen. What protocol is that? A technician checked logs rapidly. His expression tightened. There is no record of the activation sequence. Then paused, because the system had added another line beneath it. Subject recognition in progress. Back in the waiting area. The lead figure stopped directly in front of her line of sight. No sudden motion. No dramatic gesture. Just final positioning. He looked down at the device again, then up toward her. A brief silence followed, one that felt different from earlier tension. This was not uncertainty. It was confirmation preparing to surface. The hospital staff around them became still. Even those who had been skeptical earlier now watched without interruption. The lead figure spoke quietly. "Confirm identity." The phrase was not directed at the room, not at the staff, but at the system itself. A pause followed, long enough to feel extended beyond normal response timing. Then the device emitted a single tone, soft, controlled, final, and the screen displayed one line. Subject verified. A nurse near the corridor inhaled sharply. Another stepped back slightly. A doctor whispered, "Verified by what authority?" No answer came from anyone present, because the system had already moved beyond explanation. And in that moment, the woman's expression changed subtly. Not fear, not confusion. Something closer to recognition that the situation around her had finally reached its threshold. The lead figure lowered the device, then spoke again. "Come. Direct. Unavoidable. Stand by for a retrieval procedure." Inside the waiting area, the atmosphere no longer felt neutral. It had changed structure, not visibly, but psychologically. Every staff member now understood something unspoken. This was no longer a routine medical situation. The word patient no longer felt accurate in this context. The lead figure maintained position in front of her. No movement beyond necessary control. The device in his hand stayed lowered, but still active, still connected, across multiple hospital systems. Screens refreshed again, slower this time, more deliberate, as if confirming stability before proceeding further. Then a new line appeared across internal dashboards. Authority classification revised. In the administrative room, a senior coordinator stepped forward quickly. "This is impossible. We do not have authority reclassification capability." A technician scanned system logs rapidly. His face tightened. "There's no local input triggering this." He paused, then added quietly, "It's external." That single word changed the tone in the room, because external authority meant no internal override would apply. No hospital policy. No civilian restriction. No administrative halt. At the same moment, inside the waiting area, a nurse near the corridor entrance slowly lowered her clipboard. Her eyes remained fixed on the scene ahead. She whispered, "Why is everyone reacting like they already accepted this?" No one answered her, because acceptance was not being discussed. It was being imposed through system behavior. A doctor stepped slightly forward, then stopped. His attention shifted between the woman and the unit. Confusion remained in his expression. "Who approved this retrieval?" A security officer responded from behind. "No approval logs exist." A pause, then added, "But denial is also not possible anymore." That statement hung in the air, heavy, unresolved. Inside the monitoring network, a parallel system registered continued synchronization. Data streams from the hospital were now aligning with external military routing channels. No interference detected. No rejection signals. Only absorption. Back in the waiting area, the lead figure adjusted his stance slightly, not toward the staff, but toward readiness, as if anticipating the next procedural step. A faint mechanical tone followed from the device. Then a final confirmation line appeared briefly on its display. Transfer sequence preparation complete. A nurse near the back stepped back instinctively. Her voice barely audible. They're not asking anymore. The lead figure spoke again. This time without looking at the staff. Clear path. The words were simple, but their effect was immediate. Not through compliance. Through inevitability. Hospital personnel slowly began shifting aside. Not instructed. Not ordered. But responding to pressure that felt structural rather than spoken. And in the center of it all, the woman remained seated. Still present. Still conscious. But now surrounded by recognition that had arrived too late to change anything. For the first time, she exhaled slowly, as if preparing for what was now no longer approaching, but already here. Inside the waiting area, the stillness finally broke. Not through chaos, but through coordinated movement. The lead figure raised his hand slightly. A minimal signal. Yet every member of the unit responded instantly. They shifted position around the woman. Not touching. Not forcing. Just forming structure around her presence. Hospital staff watched in silence. No one intervened. Not because they agreed, but because resistance no longer felt applicable. A faint sound came from the device in the lead figure's hand. One short tone. Then another. Across the hospital network, a synchronized message flashed again on internal screens. Withdrawal authorization active. In the administrative control room, a technician leaned forward quickly. Withdrawal of what exactly? No answer came, because the system did not clarify. It only executed. Elevator logs across multiple floors updated simultaneously. Door access permissions shifted. Emergency corridors reclassified in real time. A supervisor stood up abruptly. This is restructuring the entire facility flow. A colleague responded immediately. It's not restructuring. It's extraction routing. That distinction changed the room's tension instantly. Meanwhile, inside the corridor leading toward the waiting area, security personnel attempted to reposition. But their movement was delayed. Not blocked physically, but delayed through system access denial. Door controls stopped responding. Internal badge permissions froze mid-validation. One officer stared at his handheld reader. Then whispered, "We're being locked out of our own facility." Back inside the waiting area, the lead figure stepped slightly aside, creating a clear forward path. His voice remained steady. Prepare transfer alignment. No urgency. No emotion. Only execution readiness. A nurse near the entrance swallowed hard. Her voice barely audible. Transfer to where? No response came. Because that question was no longer part of the process. It had already been decided elsewhere. The woman shifted slightly in her seat. Slow movement. Controlled. Her hand remained near her abdomen. But now her gaze lifted higher. Toward the unit. Not with fear. Not with resistance. But with awareness that the moment she had been unknowingly approaching had finally arrived. In the background, a final system update moved across every connected hospital interface. Patient release from civilian control confirmed. A doctor repeated it under his breath. Release from civilian control? He looked toward administration. No hospital can approve that. A technician responded quietly. Apparently this one didn't need approval. At that exact moment, the building's internal routing system reconfigured one last time. Paths aligned. Access cleared. Movement corridors stabilized. Not for evacuation. Not for emergencies. But for extraction. The lead figure looked toward the entrance direction. Then gave a final instruction. Move. The unit responded. And for the first time since she entered the hospital, she was no longer waiting. She was being taken. Inside the hospital corridor, movement had fully shifted into controlled extraction flow. No hesitation remained in the unit's positioning. No uncertainty lingered in their coordination. Every step was calculated around a single focal presence. The woman. As they guided her forward from the waiting area, the environment reacted in subtle ways. Doors that previously required manual authorization now opened automatically. Elevator systems adjusted floor priorities without input. Security checkpoints disengaged without visible command. It was as if the entire building had surrendered decision-making authority. In the administrative control room, a senior officer stared at the central monitor. His voice was lower than before. This level of override isn't procedural. It's a directive. A technician beside him scanned deeper logs. Then I froze. There's a classification tag appearing under her profile. He leaned closer. Then read it silently first. His expression changed immediately. No confusion anymore. Recognition of something he had never expected to see inside civilian infrastructure. He whispered, "This designation is military origin." The officer turned sharply. "That's not possible without central authorization." But the technician shook his head, because another line had appeared beneath it. Static at first, then clear. Naval Medical Directive active. The room fell into silence, because that phrase carried implications no one wanted to interpret aloud. Back in the corridor, the lead figure continued guiding the movement forward. His attention remained forward-facing, uninterrupted, controlled. A nurse walking parallel to the group spoke softly to another staff member. "Why is the hospital behaving like it's under command?" No answer came. Because the system itself was no longer behaving like a hospital network. It was functioning like a dependent layer. A subordinate structure. Inside the waiting area exit path, the woman slowed briefly. Her eyes shifted toward the surrounding personnel. For a moment, there was something unreadable in her expression. Not fear. Not confusion. But recognition that fragments of truth were aligning around her. A doctor near the corridor entrance stepped forward instinctively, then stopped, because his access tablet updated in real time without input. A single record expanded across his screen. A hidden file layer unlocked itself. He read the first line. Then I stopped breathing for a second. "What is this?" A nurse leaned closer, but he hesitated before showing her. Finally, he whispered, "This patient was never classified as a civilian intake." A pause. Then he added, "She's listed under protected operational medical designation." That sentence changed the emotional weight of the corridor, because it implied she had never been ordinary from the beginning, only hidden beneath administrative masking. Meanwhile, in the external monitoring facility, the system confirmed full synchronization status. A new directive appeared. Subject extraction legally overrides local jurisdiction. A technician stepped back from the screen. This means the hospital never had authority over her at all. Another voice replied quietly. They were just holding her until retrieval. Inside the hospital, the lead figure finally stopped at the final corridor junction. He turned slightly toward her. Not fully. Just enough for alignment. His voice lowered. Identity confirmed across all layers. A pause followed. Then the final classification appeared across every active terminal in the building. Not flashing. Not repeating. Just settling into permanence. Protected naval asset extraction approved. The corridor went silent. Because now, there was no ambiguity left. Only consequence of recognition. And the next movement was no longer about identification. It was about departure. Inside the final corridor stretch, the atmosphere no longer felt like a hospital environment. It felt like a controlled passage route. Every step taken by the unit remained precise. Every position adjusted around the woman maintained calculated spacing. No contact occurred. No unnecessary motion followed. Only movement toward exit clearance. Ahead of them, The building's exit corridor doors remained closed for a fraction of a second longer than usual. Then they unlocked automatically. Not through staff action, but through external command override. Metal panels slid apart. Cold air from outside swept inward. A shift in pressure moved through the hallway. At the same moment, the sound from above intensified again. Rotor movement stabilizing into final descent position. No longer distant. Now aligned directly with the rooftop extraction zone. Inside the hospital, staff along adjacent corridors gathered silently. Not instructed, not summoned, but drawn by unfolding certainty. A nurse near the wall whispered, "They're actually taking her out." No response followed, because the scene no longer required interpretation. It only required observation. The woman continued forward between the unit members. Her pace remained steady but weakened. Her hand still rested near her abdomen. Yet her gaze stayed forward. Focused. Aware. At the intersection leading toward the exit route, a security officer stepped forward once more, attempting final assertion. This is a protected medical facility. You cannot remove a patient without institutional clearance. The lead figure did not stop walking, only responded. Clearance has already been established above your authority. No argument followed, because the system had already validated that statement across every internal channel. Behind them, the hospital network displayed one final structural update. Local control terminated. A technician reading it slowly lowered his hands from the keyboard. We're no longer in command of this building. Inside the corridor, the exit doors finally opened fully. Beyond them, the rooftop access path was visible. Wind pressure increased. Ambient sound shifted upward. The helicopter presence now dominated the environment completely. The staff who approached the doorway instinctively stepped back. Not from instruction, but from overwhelming recognition of scale. At the rooftop threshold, the lead figure paused, then turned slightly toward the woman. A final confirmation gesture passed through the unit. Not spoken, just acknowledged. The woman stepped forward. Slow. Controlled. Each step now fully outside hospital jurisdiction. As she crossed the threshold, the hospital behind her felt distant. Not physically, but structurally detached. Inside the control room, a final system line appeared across every terminal. Transfer complete, subject removed from civilian domain. A senior doctor reading it whispered, "That means she was never truly part of our system." Another staff member responded quietly, "We were only delaying what was already decided." Above them, the helicopter remained stable in position. Rotor wash filled the rooftop space. Doors aligned for boarding. The unit guided her upward without urgency. No struggle. No resistance. Only completion of procedure. As she reached the aircraft, for the first time since entering the hospital, she was no longer inside a system that ignored her. She was inside a system that came for her. And behind her, the entire building stood silent. Watching. Processing. Understanding too late. The helicopter doors are sealed with a precise mechanical lock. No hesitation followed. No additional verification step was required. The moment she crossed the threshold, a silent confirmation pulse transmitted through multiple external channels at once. Not visible, not audible, but registered across every connected military medical node. On the hospital rooftop below, the unit remained in formation for a brief moment longer. Observing, confirming completion. Then, without ceremony, they disengaged. No announcement. No farewell. Only structured departure. The aircraft lifted gradually. Wind pressure shifted across the rooftop surface, forcing hospital staff near the edge to step back. Below them, the building no longer felt like a place of authority. It felt reduced, distant from what had just occurred above it. In the command room downstairs, a final sequence of system logs stabilized. No further reclassification. No additional overrides. Just a single finalized entry. Subject transfer successful. A long silence followed. One technician finally spoke. So, she was never really a patient here. No one responded immediately, because the system had already answered that question in its own way. A senior officer leaned back slowly. His voice was lower now. We didn't treat her. We were only part of the holding process. That statement changed the room's tone completely. Not fear. Not confusion. But realization. Outside the building, the helicopter climbed into the open sky. No circling. No delay. Direct route. Its presence diminishes in sound but not significance. Inside the aircraft, she remained seated in a secured position. Still quiet. Still composed. But now surrounded by personnel who no longer looked at her as unknown. Only as confirmed. A faint status indicator blinked once on a secure handheld device. Then it disappeared. One of the officers finally spoke, almost under breath. It's done. No one corrected him. Because there was nothing left to process. Back at the hospital, life began to resume in fragments. Not normal. Not unchanged. But fractured by what had just occurred. Staff returned to stations slowly. Some avoided speaking about it. Others checked logs repeatedly, expecting reversal. None came. Because nothing about the event was temporary. A nurse at the reception desk looked at the empty seat in the waiting area. The same place she had been ignored for hours. Now vacant. She whispered. We never saw who she really was. No one replied. And far above the city, the aircraft disappeared into the distance. Not just a patient, but a classification the hospital was never meant to understand. And somewhere in the silence that followed, one truth remained unspoken across every system that had touched her record. She was never treated like nobody. She was simply waiting to be retrieved.